the Consumer Price Index, which measures the price of goods and services, it's a nonpartisan government measurement system, shows that inflation from January last year to the present day is 7.5%, which is the highest in 40 years. Not to mention, oil prices, according to AAAgasprices.com, where you can look at the average price per gallon, the national average is what they call it, is the highest it's ever been at $4.32 per gallon. Now, you think Biden would be trying to address this issue. You think he would be doing everything he possibly could within his power to try and lower oil prices, lower spending, and do everything he could, not necessarily because he cares. Biden is a globalist. He doesn't care about the country per se, but because he wants to hold on to power and be able to keep his cronies doing business. You think he would at least try to show a semblance that he is trying to solve the problem. I mean, think about this. He could meet with the oil executives, shake his fist in their face, and create good sound bites and photo ops. He could have a meeting, because politics, a lot of it is about showmanship. That's why a lot of people don't like Trump. They can't name a single policy that they disagree with. They just don't like the way the guy acted. Biden could meet with a bipartisan group and say, we got to cut spending. Make himself look good. But is he doing that? No. What is he doing? He is blaming Vladimir Putin. Every time you hear his press secretary move her lips, she's always bringing up Putin, 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 Putin. Now, here's another fact. Russia, before we cut off imports of their oil, only supplied 8% of U.S. oil. And of course, Canada was around 16%, well, still is, last I checked. And Mexico is 21%, while the rest of it comes from us domestically. Which would make sense. I mean, Canada and Mexico are closer to the United States. So, of course, we're going to rely on them more, just like Germany and the European Union relies on Russia. Makes sense, right? But Biden wants you to think everything that happens to you is Vladimir Putin's fault. Now, is Vladimir Putin a bad guy? Absolutely. Is what he is doing in Ukraine absolutely terrible? Absolutely. I think every single person, Republican, Democrat, Libertarian, Socialist, Capitalist, whatever, every single American agrees that what Russia is doing in Ukraine is detestable. They hate it, they don't like it, they're not a fan. But is that really the reason why, when you go to the grocery store, you're paying the same amount for Doritos, but you have less chips in the bag? This is a phenomenon called shrinkflation. When you go to the grocery store, you buy a sausage. I used to eat a lot of sausage. It's tiny now, even though I'm paying the same price. M&Ms are now in tiny tubes. I remember I was a kid, I used to get a big-ass thing of M&Ms for $1. Is it really Putin's fault that all that is happening? Is it really Putin's fault that for the first time since I can remember, when you go to the grocery store, they're out of things? I was with a friend of mine who was doing Instacart the other day. Instacart is basically where you pick up groceries for people, then you deliver it to their house and they pay you a certain amount of money for doing that for them. And they were out when we were doing the Instacart of multiple items. I don't remember a time of that happening. Is that Vladimir Putin's fault? All over TikTok, all over the lamestream media, it's Putin, 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 Putin. They are trying to divert and gaslight your attention away from the domestic issues onto Ukraine and Russia. Now ask the single mother who is working 2 jobs, trying to put food on her table, to find Ukraine on a map. Ask her, when she's filling up her tank and it's costing her more, if she knows when Ukraine fell out of the Soviet Union and became an independent country. Ask her that. And even if you tell her, do you think she gives a damn? Ask your neighbor who is struggling to pay their bills, fill up their tank, if they give a damn about finding Ukraine on a map. Now, even if Biden were to get a foreign policy win, what would that mean for his administration? Because, of course, all they care about in politics is polling, right? Because polling is approval, and the more approval you have, the higher probability you have of getting reelected. I can point to 2 examples of 2 presidents in the past that have had monumental geopolitical achievements, big wins internationally. But due to certain circumstances on the domestic front, they did not really fare well when it pertained to domestic issues. The first president that comes to mind is Richard Nixon. Many historians rank Richard Nixon as one of the worst presidents of all time. Me personally, he's not one of my worst, he's not one of my best. He's in the middle. But many historians and many members of the public regard Richard Nixon as a horrible president. Richard Nixon, the first thing he did when entering office was he ended the longest war in U.S. history. In 1973, he signed a peace agreement with the Viet Cong and ended up bringing the troops home. Up until Afghanistan, Vietnam was the longest war in U.S. history. Another international win for Nixon was in 1972, when he signed the first SALT treaty with the Soviet Union. SALT stands for Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty. Basically, this was the first treaty that was signed with the Soviet Union, which lowered the missiles and nuclear weapons. That was a win. Another thing Nixon did that I would consider the crowning achievement of his presidency, the magnum opus of his presidency, was opening up diplomatic relations with China. Up until 1972, China was very closed off from the West. At that time, Mao Zedong was very private about what he was doing. Richard Nixon was able to meet with Mao Zedong, who was very old at the time. A win. Now, another win that he had geopolitically, sort of on the surface looked like a win, but it ended up also being the straw that broke the camel's back. It was the first domino to fall, which really affected his domestic issues. Israel got into a war which is known now as Yom Kippur, the 6-Day War. Richard Nixon sent in U.S. air defense. He wanted to do it undercover, but it's very difficult to hide a plane which displays proudly the stars and the stripes. Because of this, the Arab countries and the recently formed OPEC decided to stop sending oil to the US and to the West. As a result, you had a lower supply of oil. People would wait early on in the morning at gas stations for oil to fill up their cars. Gas prices skyrocketed to the highest at that time that they've ever been per gallon, over $1 per gallon, which in the 70s was unheard of. Not only did it cost more because you had a lower supply, but eventually these gas stations would run out. If you were not there early in line, you wouldn't get any gasoline. Not to mention they limited the amount you could get to 4 gallons because they had such a shortage of oil. As a result, you had a giant recession. Airlines were shut down. Schools were shut down. All of these businesses and factories were shut down because you didn't have any way to get to work and you didn't have any gas to heat your home or to supply power to that business. Not to mention, you had massive inflation. All throughout the 70s, even during the Carter administration, you had massive inflation. And due to massive inflation and due to high oil prices like we're seeing now, you had a bad economy. When people saw these things happening, it really ticked them off. Despite all of those crowning achievements, Nixon is considered by many distinguished historians as one of the worst presidents in U.S. history, due to Watergate mainly. Richard Nixon even had a quote where he said, "Domestic issues are like building outhouses in Cambodia." Basically, he was equating domestic issues to being boring. He was always more into geopolitical issues. He also implemented things like price controls. Now, if you lower the price of something, people are going to buy more of it. But there's not going to be an increase in demand. And he did that with oil, which created an even more severe shortage. Richard Nixon was a pragmatist on domestic issues. There have even been reports from individuals who served in his administration that during the last days of his presidency, when he knew that his ass was cooked, essentially, he knew he was on the way out due to Watergate, when they were discussing domestic issues like oil prices, the economy, inflation, things like that, he would doze off. But as soon as they would mention something about geopolitics, he would spike up in his chair like he got shot by a shot caller or something. But that's Richard Nixon, the tell of Richard Nixon. Another president which had many good achievements in the foreign policy realm was George Herbert Walker Bush. George Herbert Walker Bush rode on a wave of optimism from the Reagan administration. One of the achievements that Bush had during his presidency was that in 1989, he removed Noriega, who was a dictator in Panama. Basically, what happened was that Noriega had drug trafficking charges against him. The United States decided to send in troops. Noriega slithered away to the Vatican. The United States put a $1 million bounty that if anybody had information that led to his capture, it would give them $1 million. Noriega ended up surrendering. And due to that happening in Panama, Panama now has a quasi-democracy. Noriega was brought back to the United States, brought to Miami, and put in prison for 40 years due to the charges. And the new leader was more westernized. And of course, we all know the crowning achievement of Herbert Walker's presidency. When Saddam Hussein was trying to invade Kuwait, George Bush and many of the allies decided to fight back. When Saddam Hussein surrendered, George Herbert Walker Bush's approval rating was 80%, which was the highest at that time in history. The only person that reached a higher approval rating was his son, George Bush Jr., after 9/11 and right before he decided to invade Afghanistan. However, as the economic situation soured, as you had the savings and loan crisis where you had to bail out the banks due to a lot of corporate debt, GDP in 1991 was negative 0.1%. Bush had to do something. Unlike Biden, he at least attempted to do something. One of those things was lowering spending, but here is what really got him. Something that had to do with politics. He had to raise $140 billion in new taxes. Now, raising taxes is bad enough. But we all remember when Bush was running for president during his campaign, he said, "Read my lips, no new taxes." And because of the new taxes, because of the low GDP growth, negative 0.1%, his approval rating ended at 34%. Americans didn't care about what went on in Iraq. They didn't care what went on in Panama. Just like today, they don't like what's going on in Ukraine. However, you've got to do something domestically. The neighbor who's working harder, the single mother, the delivery driver, the airline pilots, the everyday people that want to go on vacation to see their family, but can't because of the fuel prices. Are they supposed to divert their attention all the way away from gas prices and inflation to Ukraine? It's a gaslighting tactic. Everything used to be the Rona, but now everything is Ukraine and Russia. But those are my thoughts. And Mr. President, if you really care about getting reelected, which I know you do, being a one-term president is equated to embarrassment, you've got to do something. And doing something good geopolitically might give you a temporary spike in an approval rating. But just like George W. Bush found out, just like his daddy found out, you got to do something domestically. And not to give Bush credit, I'm not a fan of the Bushes per se. I don't like the globalists. I'm not a fan of people who view America as just another area on the globe. But you got to give him credit that he at least tried to do something in order to stop domestic issues, even though it went against his campaign promise. You got to give him credit. And I would do the same to Biden because I call balls and strikes. I call it like I see it. But those are just my thoughts.